Ja, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, wir kommen nun zu Panel 1, das die Verhandlungen zum Washingtoner Abkommen beleuchten wird. Als Chair begrüße ich herzlich die Expertin für Völkerrecht und internationale Beziehungen, Lilly Sucharipa. Sie war in Österreich und international als Lehrbeauftragte aktiv und ist Forschungsstation des Zwischenmuseums Wien und Ehrenpräsidentin von UN Women Austria. Lilly Sucharipa, und es wurde schon erwähnt, ist auch die Witwe des leider viel zu früh verstorbenen Ernst Sucharipa. Und ich könnte noch vieles über Ernst erzählen. Er war mir nicht nur ein Freund, sondern ein wunderbarer Begleiter. Wir waren ja ein kleines Verhandlungsteam von Österreich, in dem Fall direkt mit 5 Personen. Michael Haider ist auch heute hier, Konrad Bühler, glaube ich, ist auch hier. Und Ursula Kriebaum hätte da sein sollen. Leider hat sie gestern einen kleinen Unfall gehabt und Michael Haider wird daher ihren Part heute hier übernehmen. Also noch einmal erwähnenswert eben Ernst Sucharipa, der Leiter des österreichischen Verhandlungsteams. Danke, Lilly, dass du heute hier bist und diesen Panel moderieren wirst. Danke.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to welcome you to the first panel today, which will enlighten us even more about the way to the negotiations of the Washington agreement. We are very late, I understand that, so I will try to get to the speakers right away. And as such, the first speaker will be Mr. Morgan Hall, the chief of the political unit at the U.S. Embassy, who I give you the floor.
Can everyone hear me all right? Well, so thank you, Secretary General Lessing, Deputy Director Schubert, distinguished guests, everyone who's come here today. Thank you very much for coming. Ich danke Ihnen sehr für die Einladung. On behalf of the U.S. Embassy and Ambassador Victoria Kennedy, who is traveling today and could not be here, I would like to convey our deep appreciation for the work that you all have done to commemorate the Washington Agreement and to bring together such a distinguished group of guests. It is truly humbling to look upon the work that you have all done together over decades to address these daunting and complex tasks of cataloging, evaluating, and settling the many questions of victims' compensation and restitution that emerged in the years following the end of World War II. I will keep my remarks very brief, as Ambassador Eisenstadt has already laid out in great detail the history of the agreement and expressed his deep thanks and admiration for his Austrian counterparts who accompanied him on this very long journey. Ambassador Eisenstadt was able, I think, to thank many of the people in this room in his speech today, which is quite an accomplishment for someone who's actually not present. But he, in his acknowledgements, I think, gave ample recognition to everyone here who has worked so hard to achieve all of these goals, including 2 of my panelists here as well, and the father of Lilly herself. So we have a very experienced and distinguished panel here to address the history of this agreement. I'd also like to thank President Sobotka, who was here earlier. I had the pleasure of joining Ambassador Kennedy with him a couple of weeks back at Parliament, where he led the commemoration of another example of Austria's exemplary Holocaust remembrance efforts, the Gedenkdienst. The anniversary of that service, of the Gedenkdienst, is something that we are happy to participate in. We also had speakers present from the United States who joined us. And the fact that President Sobotka was there with Foreign Minister Schallenberg commemorating this event, I think only underscores the point that Ambassador Eisenstadt made in his remarks, that Austria's commitment to Holocaust remembrance and restitution is truly exemplary and a best practice in Europe. As a diplomat posted here to Austria, I can only say that it brings me deep gratification to hear these stories of sincere cooperation and partnership on an issue of such importance and such inherent difficulty. I commend you all once again for the work that you have done, And thank you for the opportunity to highlight this important chapter of US-Austrian relations. Thank you very much. Vielen Dank.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Morgan. I will now give the floor to Ambassador Winkler, who played a distinguished role in the preparation of all the predecessors, like the negotiations with Ms. Schaumeyer, etc. But you will address these points. Mr. Winkler was head of the legal office at the time, and before that of the U.S. relations in the foreign ministry, and as such very well posed for these negotiations. Thank you. Oh, I forgot one very important point. I forgot he was Secretary of State later on, and what the most important thing is, he was the director, the dean of this wonderful institution here. So now,
thank you very much.
Now you may speak.
Thank you very much, Lilly. And I was a student at this institution. This is also very important.
Yeah. These two things you have in common with my late husband.
Indeed. Let me begin by saying that I feel very honored to speak today, but in particular about someone has joined us just a few minutes ago, whom I would like to mention. Herbert Pichler is here. I'm so glad that you could come. I'm a bit intimidated now that I have to speak in front of you.
Okay.
Now, I proposed to Lilly to abolish this panel altogether because we have heard about everything from the speeches that preceded us, in particular, of course, Sue Eisenstadt. This was a brilliant, comprehensive statement on everything that actually happened. So I see I can shorten my presentation now, and I can concentrate on some of the points that are important to me, and I'm sure also to you, why these negotiations took place and how they came about. Now, the story begins, of course, on the 13th of March of 1938, because had all these acts, these heinous crimes against the life of people, against the property, not happened, we would have not had to conduct negotiations to settle those questions. So let us always bear in mind that at the heart of the story and the matter are the atrocities committed by the Nazis. But I start immediately after 1945, when Austria was restored as an independent country. And here again, I don't have to say much because much has already been said. But the question on how Austria would deal with her role in the 7 years of Nazi occupation, also in the light of the Moscow Declaration, which has already been mentioned a few times, in particular, as far as restitution of stolen property and compensation of victims are concerned, arose immediately on the first day of the Renaissance of the Second Republic. Now, the debate within Austria and with her international partners about the obligations of Austria to redress the wrongs were without any doubt lengthy, arduous, and very often quite bitter and unpleasant, because it became evident very soon after the end of the war that many of the attitudes that had led to disaster and catastrophe in the first place still existed, and most particularly among high officials and politicians in Austria. Now, it is not up to me now to give you in detail all the measures that have been taken, many have been mentioned, that have been taken by Austria in the following 50 years. Many of which, and I have to say this, were adopted half-heartedly and only after some pressure put on by other governments, in particular, of course, by the United States. But some headlines without going into much of the detail. The state treaty obviously played an important role, not only in the history of Austria, but also as far as restitution and meeting the obligations of Austria were concerned. Article 26, which again came about mostly because of the insistence of the United States, was crucial in as far as it provided the obligation by Austria to compensate losses and restitute property. A few years later, in 1959, there was an exchange of notes constituting an agreement between Austria and the United States, where more or less, and I simplify now as a lawyer, one should never do that, but I do it anyway, where the United States certified that Austria had done about everything it had to do under the obligations of the state treaty. And this 59 agreement played an important part in the juridical part of the negotiations to the Washington Agreement. Between 1961 and then 61, another important step had taken place. The long negotiations with the World Jewish Congress and its president, Naum Goldman, were concluded in 1961 and ended in what became important in the politics and philosophy of the Austrian mind, the so-called Entfertigungserklärung. I found no real term that corresponds in English to Entfertigungserklärung. It basically said, that's it, we don't have any further demands on Austria. And I have to say, very much to my shame, when I entered the Foreign Service in 1970, in the Foreign Office and in the legal office, this was our main doctrine. Whenever someone came and said, we want something more, we said no, but Naum Goldman in 1961 signed this Entfertigungserklärung. They don't have any more claims. Now, in the next 25 years, nothing happened, really, which is not true, but for our purpose here, let me say nothing much happened until the well-known circumstances and background that led to the election of Kurt Waldheim as president of Austria in 1986. And here, I think a turn in the philosophy, in the psyche of the Austrian mind took place. For the first time, we started to rethink our role as first victim. We started to see this in a broader context. And as already been mentioned several times today, in 1991, Chancellor Vranitzky, in 1994, President Waldheim said for the first time, I'm sorry, President Kersten, for the first time, assumed a certain moral responsibility for the deeds of Austrians in the National Socialist regime. This is a very tricky question, and it's really important to bear in mind that what was acknowledged was a moral responsibility, not a legal responsibility, for deeds of Austrians committed from 1938 to 1945. In 1995, we all know that the National Fund was instituted and founded with Secretary General Hannah Lessing from the very beginning, which shows how efficient you have steered this important fund until today. But although there were certain payments foreseen in this law that instituted, that created the National Fund, there was no change in the basic philosophy that Austria would not compensate for losses. In Austria's mind, everything had been done. We don't need it to do anything more. And I think this is very important because a year later, an international debate started about assets that were stolen by the National Socialist regime and how to redress those losses. 1996 was also the first time I was confronted with this issue. I had just been appointed the head of the Americas department in the Foreign Ministry, and someone who has never been mentioned today, and I should be mentioned, called me. I had not met him before. That's Michael Haider, a lawyer, an Austrian lawyer, who was charged by Austrian companies to defend against pending, threatening lawsuits by American class action lawyers. And he said to me, listen, I've tried to talk to so many people. No one wants to listen to me, but be aware, there is something coming on to you as a country and to your companies. And yes, in 1998, the first class action lawsuits were brought before American courts. And again, something which has not been mentioned today, there were class actions against Swiss companies, against German companies, French companies, but there was, to my knowledge, not one class action directed against the state. But in the case of Austria, the class action lawyers, Fagan, Hausmann, Weiss, to mention some of the more better known ones, they brought action against Austria, the Republic of Austria, which of course, for lawyers, created the question of sovereign immunity, which was at the center of all the lawsuits, which were dismissed without any judgment anyway. So this question has never been resolved. Now, in 1998, it was already mentioned, the gold question came about. I won't talk about this anymore. It has been already mentioned sufficiently. In 1998, also Austria adopted the law on art restitution. The Historical Commission was instituted, and in 1999, the Washington Conference on looted art was adopted principles. Now we come slowly to the beginning and the framework under which the Washington Agreement negotiations started. It all started really in the year 2000, in January of 2000. And mind you, I suppose they're mostly Austrians here, elections had taken place in September or October, I don't remember, of 1999, with the Socialist Party, the Social Democratic Party, receiving 34%, if I remember correctly, and the FPÖ and the ÖVP each 27. Actually, the ÖVP was third and not second, but the negotiations with the Social Democratic Party broke apart, and Schüssel, as we all know, decided to start a coalition with the FPÖ, which led to the well-known so-called, and I insist on the so-called sanctions because there were no sanctions. There were measures taken by 14 out of 15 EU countries against Austria, trying to isolate the new government. And in January of 2000, the Stockholm Conference, which was mentioned by Sue Eisenstadt, upon the initiative of Persson, the Prime Minister, and all the Prime Ministers, Presidents from Western and Central Europe were there, including Klima, still Chancellor of the coalition government between SPÖ and ÖVP. And there, and I was present, he was confronted by Israel Singer, at the time Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress, and had other functions in international Jewish organizations. And he very bluntly said, Mr. Prime Minister, I tell you, Austria is next. Literally. He said, we have now gone after Switzerland and dormant accounts and the gold question, but now we make sure that Austria also would have to live up to its responsibility. Now, Klima couldn't say anything. He had only a few weeks left in his office. He said, well, the next government will have to deal with that. On 4th of February, Wolfgang Schüssel was sworn in by President Krestin. We all remember the face of Krestin at the time. He showed his reluctance to swear in the new government. And on the same day, 4th of February, I'm sorry if I mentioned something that fell into my court, as legal advisor, proposed to Wolfgang Leubel, at the time chief of cabinet of the chancellor, of the new chancellor to be, why don't we offer formal negotiations with American lawyers, with American representatives of Jewish organizations, and with Austrian Jewish organizations, that we are willing to open negotiations. And to my surprise, within hours, Schüssel through Wolfgang Leubel told me, yes, go ahead. So I drafted a letter, of course, wasn't sent by me, but by the Federal Chancellor. I have a photocopy here. It is interesting because we didn't even have a letterhead. There was no letterhead, the Federal Chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel. We had to type it. It went to Gideon Taylor from the Claims Conference, to Israel Singers and others, and I quote just a page and a half, but I only quote one paragraph. In this connection, I would like to reiterate the commitment of Austria to continue to cooperate with all international institutions and bodies that were formed in the last few years to look into all questions related to Holocaust assets. We continue to fully subscribe to the principles of the international community developed at London, Washington, and Stockholm. I would also like to underline that the work of the Historical Commission is well underway, and the first partial results have already been presented. And now, he said, having said this, I fully understand the concern that in view of the age of the Holocaust survivors, quick solutions are asked for. Indeed, a number of facts are already on the table, and there's no need to wait for the final report of the Historical Commission. And he then offered formal negotiations to take place. He also said, at this stage, I cannot be more precise as to the details of such an interim solution than just to inform you about the willingness to quickly react to the concerns that you personally and other institutions who present Holocaust victims have expressed. Now, there was already in the ballpark a figure that was in the mind of the organizations and of the Austrian government. There was $150 million to be used for victims who had not received any compensation until then. This is important to remark because 150 million in the mind of the Austrian Chancellor at the time was the final figure. And when he appointed Lilly Sucharipa and sent him to Washington, a mission impossible, a real mission impossible, poor Ernst was under strict instructions not to go beyond the 150 million at all. When negotiations started on the 24th of October at 9:30 in the evening, and I can be very precise because, as Stu mentioned, there was a link between the negotiations on the forced laborers and on the property restitution. And in the framework agreement, which had been signed on the 5th of October with Stu Eisenstadt in Vienna, it was agreed that negotiations on the property questions would begin immediately after the signing of the agreement. And that was at 9 in the evening. At 9:30 in the evening, we met at the Neue Amtsgebäude, a terrible place without windows, and started the negotiations. I will not go into the details now on each step. I'm sure that others will do that. It's also important to note that at this particular time, Herbert Pichler, on the insistence on the class action lawyers and the Jewish organizations, was appointed as representing the Austrian economy, Austrian business, which was very important. And Herbert Pichler played an immensely important role, and I thank him for that. We were really a team in the best sense of the word. Then, of course, on the 17th of January, the Washington Agreement was signed, but the story does not end here, unfortunately. And I have to say this because Wolfgang Schüssler, before he left, he said, luckily, no one mentioned the role of the class action lawyers. But I do. They, in particular one, I'm not going to mention his name, you can read about him in the book Imperfect Justice by Sue Eisenstadt, delayed the entering into force of the Washington Agreement for 4 years. Now, the Austrian government decided upon its own to let the agreement enter into force in part before formal legal peace was achieved. But it was, I mean, Wolfgang Schüssler reminded me, a number of old victims, both forced laborers and victims of expropriation of assets, died. And they could have been recompensated had the agreement entered into force earlier. I end here, but I want to mention in the end that there's a legacy. Not only the National Fund continues, there's no end date to the National Fund, which is very important, but also I would like to mention the Future Fund. The Future Fund, which I'm happy to announce, will be prolonged for another 5 years. It's in the draft budget, so I assume that the draft budget will be adopted in a couple of weeks. And then there will be, again, the necessary funds to continue the very important Future Fund, which was created from the money that was left in the Reconciliation Fund, and thus very useful work. I say this because I happen to be the vice chairman of this fund, and I'm also a member of the board, but it does very important work. Thank you very much, Lilly, if I've been too long, but that is.
I have to say, you mentioned in the beginning, we should just not hold this panel because there will be nothing new, but there was a lot of new things which were very important and very enlightening. Thank you very much. I would like now to turn to Mr. Pichler, who played, as already mentioned, a very important role in bringing up the finances for the negotiations solution. I apologize for not mentioning other roles in your life and in your CV, but you can all read that in your brochure. All the CVs are in there, so I think we will turn right away to you.
Let me contribute from my side, and I would like to start with the congratulations to the Austrian National Fund for the excellent work, to all its presidents, and especially to the Secretary General and her team, Anna Lessing. More than 20 years after the negotiations to reach the Washington Agreement, it's a great opportunity for me as member of the negotiation team to evaluate and to consider what we have done in the years 2000 and 2001. Therefore, it shouldn't be forgotten, and as it was mentioned today, that after the remarkable speeches of President Thomas Klestil and Chancellor Franz Wernicki in Israel, it was the initiative of Chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel to contribute to the processing with our own history. He has chosen Maria Schaumayr, the former president of the Austrian Central Bank, to find a solution for the forced and slave labor issue, and Ernst Sucharipa as special envoy for the difficult property restitution and compensation negotiations. And in this sense, he has chosen two extraordinary persons. To be clear, from my point of view, it was a necessary initiative and in an initiative to face Austria's moral responsibility. In our negotiations, and beside Chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel, the leadership of Ernst Sucharipa, whose wife is with us today, and excellently supported by Hans Winkler, was decisive for the success of these negotiations on our side. In the so-called pizza discussion, it was agreed between Secretary Eisenstadt and Wolfgang Schüssel that a representative of the Austrian economy should take part in these negotiations. This was my task. Chancellor Schüssel was directly involved in the whole negotiations, and with Secretary Eisenstadt, we had a tough, experienced, and remarkable negotiator on the other side. For me, the official task started in the morning of the 24th of October with Secretary Eisenstadt and the US ambassador, together with Ernst Sucharipa, in the morning before the signing ceremony of the slave labor agreement in the Hofburg with President Thomas Klestil and Maria Schaumayr took place. We started the negotiations, and from my side, to get, first of all, a better knowledge of all the deficiencies and gaps, and to find a visible sign for those who suffered this terrible, and for all of us, unimaginable time. But everyone who had experienced these negotiations knows how difficult and intensive these negotiations and this topic was. And no doubt, there were a lot of demanding situations in these negotiations. The negotiations took place in a relatively short period, up to the 17th of January 2001, only 3 days before the inauguration of the new US government took place. And it reminds me only on the last 2 days when we negotiated in Washington, where enormous work was done, and in the last on the last days, including the whole night, more or less. And only an experience we saw in the State Department, the incoming new Minister of Foreign Affairs. That would be impossible in Austria, maybe. And between the negotiations and besides the negotiations, I had to always to inform and sometimes to convince the leaders of different parts of the Austrian economy about the questions which have to be answered, and often quickly. But it's necessary to say I got a great support by the president of the Federal Economic Chamber, Christoph Leitl, and especially by the leaders of the banking industry, President Walter Rottensteiner, Christian Konrad, Andreas Streichel, and Helmut Elsner. When the negotiations were completed, and all who were involved will never forget these days, it was the intention of Chancellor Schüssel to bring this package to the parliament and taking into account the parliamentarian procedures. It took only 2 weeks, and on the 31st of January, an unanimous decision, and that was very important for Austria, was reached. I know this date very well. The 31st of January was the birthday of my wife, and I was in Parliament the whole day. As an internal guideline and additional to the support of the government, there should be a significant and essential contribution of the businesses, especially of the banking and insurance industry, as a precondition. To give you an impression, after the signing of the agreement, it was possible to reach the support of all Austrian banks after intensive internal discussions, but without any public comments and without any public resistance. And this should be emphasized. It was part of the agreement that the whole amount should be paid when the last claims in the United States were settled or dismissed. Mrs. Lessing told me later she was surprised how precise the guaranteed contributions were paid around Christmas in the years 2005 to 6, as we have promised it before. But as we have heard, beside the material compensation and other monetary elements, the enormous increase of the social benefits for survivors was an important part of the package. But, and that's very important, the significance of the agreement, and this should be underlined, goes far beyond. It was an important and unspoken message for all of us to be aware of the obligation, to contribute to the education of next generations with our knowledge, what was possible in such a terrible time. And we have all to contribute to these efforts up to now. Only as an example, after a request of Stuart Eisenstadt, I could personally contribute significantly with the support of the banking and insurance industry to the performance of the Defiant Requiem in memory of the Theresienstadt tragedy in the Viennese Konzerthaus. All participants were deeply moved by the performance, and this evening was carried by the same spirit of reconciliation as our negotiations did when we found an agreement. And as another example, a small but important step from the common hometown of Ernst Sucharipa and me, our city of Stockerau, it's the largest city in the so-called Weinviertel in Lower Austria, in the province of Lower Austria, restored the Jewish cemeteries very soon, and as I have heard, as one of the first Austrian cities, and organized this year so-called memorial stones to the remembrance of Jewish citizens who lived in this city. That's my contribution at this point. Okay.
Thank you very much, Herbert. I thank you specifically that you mentioned the cemeteries issue, because I remember how proud my husband was when he saw that his native community native city has restored the cemetery so well. And I visited it now on the 1st of November, and it's really a treasure. It's beautifully restored, very well kept, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you. I will now give the floor to Mr. Haider, who was member of the team of my husband's in the negotiations, as well as and is now dealing in the foreign ministry with Holocaust-related issues and the IRA at the Office of the Legal Advisor. So he's deeply involved with the topics, and you will have a chance to see and hear him on a panel later, chairing the final panel. But he will now be kind enough to read you the statement Professor Kriebaum would have held. She had an accident, as mentioned, and she is not allowed to speak. So otherwise she would have come anyway. But I give the floor now to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm terribly sorry. I'm presumably not as eloquent as Ursula Kriebaum, but you will forgive me. I'm just reading her text. The Austrian Holocaust Restitution Negotiations 2000-2001. Point of departure. On the 18th of May 2000, Austrian Chancellor Dr. Wolfgang Schüssel appointed the Dean of Vienna's Diplomatic Academy, Ambassador Dr. Ernst Sucharipa, as special envoy for restitution issues. Ambassador Sucharipa was tasked with developing, in collaboration with representatives of victims of National Socialism, quote, approaches to a comprehensive resolution of open questions related to the restitution of or compensation for looted assets, including proposals for required legislation. Recognizing the potential for the development of a sustainable resolution that the Austrian political landscape of the year 2000 provided, Ambassador Sucharipa accepted the mandate. He exercised the mandate pro bono in addition to his duties as Dean of the Diplomatic Academy. He considered himself a loyal representative of the Republic of Austria. Simultaneously, he was committed to achieving a result that did the victims of Nazism justice. In an effort to satisfy both requirements, his personal approach, while particularly conducive to the substance of the task, was also enormously taxing in terms of the self-imposed moral burden. The necessity of developing a solution by means of dialogue with victim representatives characterized the structure of the negotiating teams. As a result, two governments, several non-governmental organizations, and victim attorneys participated in the negotiations. The representatives of the victims' associations were essential in contributing their perspective in terms of identifying prevalent deficits. As many as 80 participants contributed to the individual negotiation rounds, some holding divergent and differently focused views. The US government assumed both the role of partner in the negotiations on the one hand, and that of facilitator/mediator with regard to the victims' associations and the plaintiff attorneys on the other. A further significant feature was the style in which negotiations were conducted, treating the victims inclusively and taking their concerns seriously characterized Ernst Sucharipa's approach. He assigned high priority to meetings with representatives of victims' associations in the context of his explanatory discussions. In particular, A July 2000 meeting with the American Council for Equal Compensation of Nazi Victims from Austria left Ernst Sucharipa deeply impressed on a personal level. This meeting proved decisive for the importance accorded to social measures contained in the Washington Agreement. It was crucial for the success of the negotiations to ensure that the two sides shared the same interpretation of both the historical facts and the present-day needs of the victims. As a result, reaching a consensus regarding the manifest gaps and deficiencies of earlier restitution measures and devising new ones capable of bridging these shortcomings emerged as the main objective. The first step was therefore to identify such gaps and deficiencies. This was no easy task given the complex Austrian restitution and compensation legislation. At the time, the Historical Commission, the Historical Kommission, had not produced any reports yet, with the exception of its work on tenancy rights. The negotiators identified two main types of gaps and deficiencies. There were, first, a number of categories that had never, or only in exceptional cases, been subject to compensation. This was the case, for example, regarding leased apartments and liquidated businesses. The second category was comprised of gaps and deficiencies caused by restitution measures that had only led to partial compensation or resulted in individual decisions which could only be qualified as extremely unjust. The proposed solutions in various compensatory categories reflected the complexity of these gaps and deficiencies. The objective was therefore to identify and develop solutions for shortcomings, both in terms of restitution and compensation measures, as well as social benefits. The first interim result was a political framework agreement devised for the purpose of guiding further restitution negotiations. It was named, quote, Framework Concerning Austrian Negotiations Regarding Austrian Nazi-Era Property/Aryanization Issues, unquote, and was presented on 5th of October 2000 in Vienna. It reflected not only the structure of further negotiations, but also that of the Washington Agreement. There was a general consensus among the negotiating partners that the solution would comprise two components: the swift disbursement of lump sum compensation payments to living victims of Nazi regime, and compensation payments calculated on the basis of losses suffered, which would include heirs as beneficiaries. All negotiating partners rejected a solution based exclusively on lump sum payments as inadequate. The Vienna Framework Agreement earmarked a total sum of $150 million for swift compensation payments to living Holocaust victims originating from Austria. The National Fund of the Republic of Austria for Victims of National Socialism was designed to disperse these payments in an expedited manner. These payments were designed to conclusively compensate the loss of, first, apartments and small business leases, second, household effects, and third, personal valuables, insofar as not auctioned off by the Moderatorin, an Austrian auction house. This approach lent itself to the achievement of several objectives. The existing gaps and deficiencies were obvious, and all living victims, with very few exceptions, received swift monetary payments. With a view to other, as yet unresolved claims, the Framework Agreement provided for the establishment of a general settlement fund, the Allgemeine Entschädigungsfonds. The characteristic features of the fund included a financial cap, the allocation of payments on a pro rata basis, and the assurance of legal closure for Austria and Austrian companies before US courts. In addition, at this stage, it was agreed that compensation and restitution measures already implemented by the Republic of Austria in the past would be fully considered. The ensuing restitution negotiation focused on defining categories of claims affected by the gaps and deficiencies in Austria's previous restitution legislation and administrative practices, as well as the specific amount of designated payments. For this purpose, a series of 8 rounds of intensive negotiations started in Vienna on 24th of October 2000. It resulted in a comprehensive agreement on unresolved restitution issues between the Republic of Austria, the US government, the victims' associations, and the plaintiffs' attorneys, concluded on 16th and 17th January 2001 in Washington. The result of the negotiations. The commitments made in Austria in the context of the Washington agreements consist of the following categories. First, compensation for the loss of alienized flats, household effects, and personal valuables. Second, the General Settlement Fund. Third, in rem restitution of publicly owned property. Fourth, various social measures. And fifth, subsidiary agreements. As already mentioned, the social measures were of special importance for the victims and the Republic. They comprised payment of the equivalent of all levels 1 to 7 of care allowance, so-called Pflegegeld, rather than such limited to level 2 as it was previously the case for victims living outside of Austria. The repealment of the citizenship eligibility requirement for pensions pursuant to the Victims' Welfare Act, and an extension to the preferential right to retroactively purchase pension rights. The General Settlement Fund comprised 2 separate components, named claims-based and equity-based processes. An independent 3-member claims committee decided on all the applications. The governments of the United States and of Austria nominated 1 member each, which together chose the 3rd, acting as chair. In the context of the claims-based procedure, applications were submitted with the purpose of approving payments relating to loss or damage pertaining to the following assets categories: liquidated businesses, including licenses and other business assets; real property, insofar as the in rem restitution is not applicable; bank accounts, stocks, bonds, and mortgages; movable property, insofar as they had not already been compensated pursuant to the amended National Fund Act; and insurance policies. In addition to the categories named above, the equity-based procedure received claims relating to occupational and educational losses incurred as consequence of or in connection with events on the territory of today's Republic of Austria during the Nazi era, or any other loss or damage incurred as consequence of or in connection with events on the territory of today's Republic of Austria during the Nazi era, insofar as these losses and damages do not fall within the remit of the agreement concerning benefits for the former slave and forced laborers of the National Socialist regime, or statutory provisions on in rem restitution of assets in public ownership. An autonomous 3-member arbitration panel, subject to the same appointment mechanism as the Claims Committee, rendered decisions on the in rem restitution of seized real estate held in public ownership on January 17, 2001. Both procedures only dealt with such claims where the particular claim to a certain asset had never been subject to settlement by mutual agreement or the conclusive decision of an Austrian court or administrative authority, with the following exceptions. First, decisions of settlements by mutual agreement that constituted instances of extreme injustice, requiring a majority vote by the Claims Committee and unanimity in cases of in rem restitution. Second, claims rejected by Austrian courts or administrative authorities on grounds of lack of evidence, where such evidence was not available to the claimant at the time, but had become available in the meantime. And in all, it may be noted that the measures provided for under the Washington Agreement have led to a paradigm shift in comparison to earlier restitution measures. Before the Washington Agreement, Measures in the field of restitution were essentially limited to victims being required to accomplish the return of looted property in proceedings before courts and/or administrative authorities. In many cases, that meant that victims living abroad litigated against Austrian residents holding the pertinent assets, with the Republic merely providing a legal forum. Now, save in rem real estate restitution, monetary compensation is awarded rather than restitution, funded both by Austria's business sector and the federal budget. With the General Settlement Fund, there is an institution that assists victims and their heirs in submitting claims and required documents. Legal certainty, definitive closure. As a final thought, I would like to touch upon an aspect that was always of particular significance to Ambassador Sucharipa. The legal certainty which was necessary to facilitate the operation of the treaty does not, and indeed may not, in any way relate to the concept of a definitive closure, which may never be reached. In the, quote, basic principles and guidelines on the right to remedy and reparation for victims of violations of the international human rights and humanitarian law, unquote, adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in December 2005, compensation and restitution are complemented by rehabilitation, satisfaction, and the guarantee of non-repetition. In this context, commemoration, the search for truth, and punishment of perpetrators are of particular significance. It was important to Ambassador Sucharipa to utilize the public attention generated by the negotiations as means to draw the public eye towards the discussion on and awareness of problems regarding Austria's previous handling of this part of its past. And Sucharipa was aware of the fact that the untold suffering inflicted upon Jewish citizens and other victims of National Socialism during the Nazi era could never be compensated. What he did accomplish, however, was an arrangement pertaining to looted property, which was commensurate with international standards. His approach aimed to contribute to the restoration of the victims' dignity and to provide them with the assurance that the injustice had been recognized, acknowledged by society as such, reacted to as adequately as possible, and that repetitions would be prevented at any costs. The following statement, made at a press conference on 17th of January 2001, demonstrates how important this was to him. Quote, we have been certainly talking primarily about money, and I know that no amount of money can undo the tremendous suffering and losses that have been inflicted on our Jewish citizens. It is clear that this must not be used as an excuse not to tackle these other issues of monetary compensation. However, I am in particular thankful to Randy Schoenberg, the grandson of one of Austria's most prominent composers, for having helped us to also raise our eyes beyond the issue of monetary compensation. One of the side effects of our negotiations, maybe one of its most important results, is the intensive discussion that has been started in the Austrian media on Holocaust issues, unquote. From a human rights perspective, no definitive closure can or may ever be reached. Rather, it is the task of all of us to ensure that knowledge of the crimes committed against the victims is passed on and that such violation of human rights are efficiently prevented. Thank you.
Thank you very much for reading Professor Kriebaum's statement. I know that she is following us online, so the applause was also for hers. I think, Hannah, if it's possible, I would do a small round of discussions. So whoever has a question, please 15 minutes, 10 minutes.
If you're not too hungry.
Please.
Thank you all the speakers for giving insights in the procedures. And I would be very interested, Mr. Winkler, what motivated you back then in time to draft this letter?
I think it has already been mentioned by Stu Eisenstadt that at the time when Schüssel offered these negotiations, there had already been a consensus in the Austrian government, also with Chancellor Klima at the time, that given the international environment at the time, 97, 98, 99, and what had happened in the various conferences with the class actions against Switzerland, Germany, negotiations with Germany had already been in the course and were almost completed at the time, 2000. So it was quite natural that Austria would definitely not escape its responsibility to also negotiate with the victims. So it was nothing that fell out of the sky, but it was something that I knew, and I was responsible in my office for those questions, that sooner or later Austria would also have to come to terms with these questions. And I thought, also given the international response to the formation of the government, that better sooner than later. So this is why I proposed already very early into the coalition government that we start these negotiations, that we give the signal that we are ready to negotiate. And I would also mention one thing. Chancellor Schüssel, which had also to do with his personal history, which, by the way, he also told Stu Eisenstadt, was personally convicted that this must be done, irrespective of the political circumstances. He was convinced that Austria had to come to terms with these questions. And this is why I think I ran into open doors. And it took him only a couple of hours to say, yes, go ahead. We do that. We must do that, and better sooner than later.
Another question?
Yes.
Yes, a second. Yeah, Hella. Hella
Well,
Pick.
I don't quite know to address this, but I would like to know to what extent Herr Winkler or Herr Pichler feel that the agreement helped to soften the international impression of Austria as a basically anti-Semitic society.
Yeah. Would you like to?
From my perspective, it was an essential step what Austria did at this time. But it was not easy to find a solution and the right balance. What can be done, but what have to be done, and to face the gaps and deficiencies. I think this was the main story behind our negotiations at that time. But as I mentioned before, the significance of the agreement goes far beyond. And that's the important message for today. And there are a lot of steps which can be done and can be done every year. And therefore, I mentioned only these two examples, not only on the top level, but on the level, on different levels. And that's so important.
Well, Helen, to answer your question, yes, I believe it did. actually, because, I mean, the shadow of the Waldheim years were still upon Austria. But on the other hand, already years, in the months at least, if not years, before the beginning of the negotiations, Austria had done a lot, including certain things which no other country did, like art restitution, for example. So I believe in the end, yes, it certainly corrected the international view of those who had a negative image of Austria and Austrians, and it certainly did help. I don't think that this was the purpose, or at least not the primary purpose for all of this, but it was certainly an effect. And the same is probably true for other countries. It's not a specific Austrian problem.
Thank you. There was another question in the Ferdinand Trautmannsdorf, Ambassador Trautmannsdorf.
My question would be to Dr. Pichler. You mentioned a number of heads of our banks at that time who were cooperative, but what was your main arguments with those who were not that cooperative?
It's clear in such a discussion, you can only mention a few ones. And therefore, I said after the names and some others. You have to bear in mind, once again, that the negotiations took place in a relatively short period. And within these times and between the negotiations, I had to inform the different parts of the economy what we are discussing and negotiating. And therefore, the main discussion with the economy took part after the signing ceremony in Washington. And you have to imagine, so you are the representative of the different parts of the economy, and you have started the discussion. Do you know what you have to pay within a relatively short period? And that these negotiations are not always very easy, should be clear. But therefore, it's very important that I can say that we could get the support of all the, as an example, all the Austrian banks. And we have promised the different components. And as I mentioned, when the whole amount have to be paid, we could fulfill all what we have promised. Very precise, very precise. Mrs. Lessing was astonished that, or surprised how precise we could be at that time. It's not the question who has supported and who has not supported, more or less, but in such a function, you need some leading people who give you the support. I remember Hans Winkler mentioned the first round of negotiations on the 24th. We started at 9 o'clock in the evening. And I thought at midnight it could be finished for this day. And we negotiated until maybe 3 o'clock in the morning. And we continued next day at 8 o'clock in the morning. It was not so easy. And then you go to the leaders and try to tell them what we have negotiated.
Then just to set the record straight, one bank, a bank group, did not participate because they had already settled 1 year before with one of the class action lawyers, which is the infamous Ed. And they negotiated a $40 million settlement with the Bank Austria. So they did not participate in the settlement because they had already settled out of court before.
Thank you. I think we can take one or two more, Hannah, questions. Okay, then the lady here, and then there was, yeah. Okay, please go ahead.
Well, I think there is a very essential contradiction in terms and regarding the banks, because Bank Austria, which are formerly Kreditanstalt, Länderbank, and Central, already had to have their own historical commission, and they hadn't finished. To a certain extent, they had settled out of court, but their findings were only published in 2006. So I see great difficulties there, essential country with the banks.
A few years ago, American diplomacy opened a new museum in Founding, Museum of U.S. Diplomacy. One of the founder is Robert Neumann. His father was another famous U.S. ambassador born in Vienna. And this, we remember, is one of the cornerstones of the Austrian-American relations. And Reboot America or Reboot the Relations is one of the missions. Is there any plan to deposit some objects of this contract at this new founded museum or subsidize this museum?
No idea.
Have you any idea? I
Not that I'm
think
aware of, no.
that we would have to ask this question to Stu Eisenstadt. He might know, and I think he would be also the right person to initiate something like that.
Neumann, for example. Not only, there are 10, 12 persons born in Vienna.
Born in Vienna and serving for the United States.
Helene von Damm was also was.
Yeah, that would be a part of interesting history. Thank you very much for following this panel. I think we got a lot of new insights, especially concerning the negotiations and the mechanics of this important, getting this important issue together, which is not only money, but also especially the way of giving the still surviving victims the necessary social security issues, the cemeteries, and what is also very important is to give them the feeling that they are not forgotten and that that Austria finally sees and acts according to what it owes. Thank you very much.
Ja, danke vielmals, Lilly, für die Leitung dieses Panels und auch an den Teilnehmern an diesem Panel. Vielleicht darf ich ganz kurz, bevor ich dann in die Mittagspause überleite, die wir bis 1:30 machen werden. Also wir haben eine Stunde Mittagszeit. Danke, dass es sich ein bisschen die Zeit aufgeholt hat. Hans Winkler hat einige Meilensteine erwähnt. Und das hat eben auch, glaube ich, zu diesem Brief geführt. Und einige Zeit lang hat man uns ja nachgesagt, dass wir mehr miteinander reisen in der Weltgeschichte als mit unseren damaligen Partnern und Ehefrauen in deinem Fall. Da war die London Gold-Konferenz, wo ich das Vergnügen hatte, mit dir dabei zu sein. Da war das Washington Holocaust Era Asset Conference, die Stockholmer Konferenz. Und dann kam eben dieser Ruf von Ernst Sucharipa, dass ich in das Verhandlungsteam kommen sollte. Und er wurde ja wirklich oft eben jetzt auch erwähnt, nicht nur, weil er so ein wunderbarer Verhandler war, sondern weil er darüber hinaus eben sich ganz, ganz tiefe Fragen gestellt hat. Und es ist zweimal erwähnt worden. Ich erinnere mich nach einer der Verhandlungsrunden in Washington, die auch so gegen 3 Uhr früh geendet ist. Aber meistens war das so. Also nicht nur einmal sind Ernst und ich dann nach dem letzten Bier spazieren gegangen und haben uns einfach gefragt, tun wir das Richtige? Wird es jemals genügen? Und es war Ernst und mir vollkommen bewusst, und auch Ernst kannte die Geschichte meines Vaters. Mein Vater ist selbst 39 nach Palästina geflohen und meine Großmutter wurde in Auschwitz ermordet. Und mein Vater, wie ich diesen Job angenommen habe, der eine Berufung geworden ist, hat mir gesagt, kannst du mir meine Kindheit zurückgeben? Kannst du meine Mutter aus Auschwitz zurückbringen? Und das war Ernst unglaublich bewusst, auch aufgrund seiner vielleicht doch lang vergrabenen Familiengeschichte. Und wir haben so viel gesprochen und er hat mir so viel geholfen. Und das hat diese ganzen Spirit gegeben. Einerseits eben, Hans, dass du über die Jahre diese ganzen wichtigen Konferenzen mitgemacht hast und gewusst hast, Österreich muss hier zu seiner Verantwortung stehen. Und Ernst in der Kombination dann mit uns allen im Team. Also wirklich danke, danke allen für die Beteiligungen und dieses Überzeugtsein, dass Österreich hier was tun muss. Dankeschön.